Here's the first chapter of the book. All from me to you. Let's get that microphone in there. Okay, this is Travis and the Labyrinth by Matt Shore. Alright? First chapter. I can't give you any more than that because... The Orphanage. Nestled in the southern forest of Great Start. I nailed it right off the bat. Nestled in the southern forest of Crankfurt, in an isolated village called Mercy Square, there was a skinny boy with sandy blonde hair named Travis. Travis was an orphan. He lived in Mercy Square's ramshackle orphanage, along with 24 other children whose parents were dead, missing, or simply did not want them. It was a quiet life of daydreams and doldrums, aside from the rantings and ravings of the orphan keeper, Walkenstuck. Walkenstuck was an oblong man with a ruddy throat. Due to poor dental hygiene, Walkenstuck's phlegm was so severe that he often sounded like he was yodeling. This made listening to him severely unpleasant, beyond the fact that he never had anything pleasant to say. "Listen here, you little snot weasels," Walkenstuck had said one morning. His declarations usually meant new rules, which in turn meant new reasons to punish the orphans. Standing in the center of the orphans' shared bedroom, he had told them all, "You are hereby forbidden to speak to the people in town. I don't want you lot spreading any more lies about me. I have been fatherly and kind to each of you, even those of you who barely deserve it." This was when Walkenstuck shot a suspicious look at Travis. The other orphans followed his gaze and mimicked the man's scorn, muttering to one another about what a rotten stink beetle Travis was. Travis merely sighed and shook his head, letting his locks wobble to and fro. After years of Walkenstuck's contempt, Travis was used to this sort of thing. Rather than meeting Walkenstuck's eyes, Travis tried to find a friendly crack in the floor, hoping that acting innocent might help him avoid another unwarranted walloping on the noggin. Walkenstuck grumbled in Travis's direction, but it seemed as though Travis was merely a diversion. After shuffling his tongue around a bit, Walkenstuck continued his rant. "I have heard from Gunther, that arrogant woodsman who's always strutting around the village as if he were the queen. He said that the two of you scumflies told lies about me in exchange for biscuits. As if my cooking wasn't enough to sate you. I provide the very best. But you told him that I serve you slop. Outrageous. Let's just see what you get." The orphans went wide-eyed and gritted their teeth in anticipation of whatever the tyrant had planned. With a turn of his heel, Walkenstuck approached the only upright piece of furniture in the room, a bed that the children had cobbled together from split logs, broken planks, and straw. Walkenstuck raised his mud-painted boot above the bed, while the children gaped in horror. Down came his foot, again and again, crash, crash, crash. Walkenstuck stomped the bed to pieces. Though Travis was unpopular amongst the other orphans and had never been allowed to sleep in the bed, he was horrified on everyone's behalf. He'd known Walkenstuck to be cruel, but this seemed extreme even by the orphan keeper's standards. Travis felt a strange sensation. It was like Balian Road, the fate of passion was burning within his heart, surging with fiery fury at the sight of this injustice. As he watched Walkenstuck stomp the bed flat, Travis's fists trembled with anger. "I wish I could punish you, Walkenstuck," Travis thought. "One day, when I am grown, I will come back here and teach you a lesson." But a pang of anxiety within Travis's mind made him wonder if he would ever have the opportunity to leave the orphanage at all, let alone return. As the bed crumbled to bits, Walkenstuck wheezed and clutched at his chest, short of breath. The orphans wept and clung to one another, trying hard not to make too loud a whimper for fear of catching the man's attention. The orphan keeper grumbled, rubbed his head, and exited the orphan's bedroom, slamming the door as if the moment had passed and no more needed to be said. Though they were relieved to see him leave, the orphans knew well enough that this reprieve might be temporary. Certainly, there were times when Walkenstuck seemed studious, hard-working, and reliable, but there were other times when his rage unbridled him from reality. Once his tantrums began, there would be no quelling them until he disappeared into his study, where he would usually write a furious letter of grievances to the world at large. He would then read the letters to the orphans with booming oration, over and over, until they begged him to stop. One time he had shouted so loudly that the paintings had fallen from the walls, or fallen off the walls. At least, that was what Travis's friend Rudy had told him. Travis dreamed of escaping this wretched place, leaving the hard stone walls of Mercy Square behind and exploring the forest beyond. His deepest desire was to visit the Clockwork City, the capital of Crankfurt, where the princess lived. The other orphans often spoke of how beautiful the city was, and how rotten it was that they'd never get to see it. It was their lot in life to live and die in Mercy Square. Travis tried to memorize every fact about the Clockwork City that he could discover, however poorly vetted or unverifiable it may have been. Most of his worldly knowledge came from the only book he owned. It was an old tome he'd borrowed from Wolkenstock's study called Wonky's Crankfurten Monsters. I'll say that again. Wonky's Crankfurten Monsters. Travis had snuck into the study. Snuck, that's a real word. Okay, no more commentary from me. While Wolkenstock was berating another orphan for sneezing too loudly. The study was a small, cramped room packed to the brim with books. The books seemed to give Wolkenstock wild ideas, but they also resulted in a lot of excess chores for the orphans. Once Wolkenstock had read a book on military strategy during the Grimalkin Wars, then came bursting forth from his study, declaring that the orphans would henceforth be required to perform rigorous combat drills every morning. This is why many of the orphans hated books and refused to learn how to read. They blamed books for Wolkenstock's outbursts. Some of them even wanted to burn his study down, though they could not work out how to do so without setting the whole orphanage ablaze. Travis knew how to read and loved to do so, but that fact made him even more ostracized. He assumed that his mother or father had taught him how, but he could not recall enough of his past to be certain. Before he'd read Wonky's Crankfurten Monsters, Travis's eyes had been relatively closed. He had only known of the town he lived in, Mercy Square, the forest of no mercy that surrounded its walls, and the Jarders, a ravenous red ape horde that stabbed humans with their barbed tails. They were taken for granted in this region, and were the reason few villagers ventured beyond the city walls. As a result of the Jarders, few visitors ever arrived in Mercy Square, and those that did had little positive to say about the place that might inspire future tourism. Once Travis had started reading the book, his mind began buzzing with possibilities. Travis wanted to see the spire of the Princess's Tower in the Clockwork City. He imagined the princess in his mind every day as he gazed out the window at the trees, hoping somehow to catch a glimpse of her, though he knew deep down the distance made it impossible. Still, he could picture her so clearly in his mind. She would have a blue crown with many horns. She would wield a gilded scepter used to strike her foes in the head. Her hair would be larger than a horse, and it would dance through the air like ribbons in the breeze. He was certain his vision of the princess was accurate, though it was based solely on rumor and speculation. On the morning that Travis turned 13 years of age, he decided that he'd had enough of dreaming, wishing, and wanting. From that day forward, he would dedicate himself to escaping from the orphanage at all costs. "Today," he proclaimed to the others, "I'm a man of 13. You must all respect me as a man from now on." This, of course, was grounds for a savage beating from the other orphans. Who was Travis to declare himself a man? He was a sniveling worm like the rest of them. And after a few socks to the jaw, kicks to the ribs, scratches to the cheek and arms, Travis realized that saying some words and accomplishing a deed were two completely different things. "They do not understand me," Travis thought, curled up in a ball of bruises. "I shall keep my plans to myself." The other boys hadn't really meant to hurt him, just to teach him his place and to remind him that he was no better than they were. But the lesson had failed to stick. Travis, though slightly bloodied, was inspired by this beating to work even harder to escape. Why should he hang around a bunch of louts willing to club him for declaring his heart's purest wish? Sure, they were all starving for familial love and desperate to hide any sign of weakness, but that did not mean Travis had to consign himself to their short-sighted worldview. He just knew that something different was waiting for him outside the walls of Mercy Square, and even if it wasn't perfect, it had to be better than Wolkenstock. Rudy, Travis's lone friend, tried to soothe his bruised body, rubbing his sore spots gently with a living snake that she'd caught in the bushes outside. "Are you sure this is working?" asked Travis, wincing. "Hush," said Rudy. "You need to soak up its slime or you'll never get better." Travis was not convinced that Rudy was particularly skilled in animal care or medicine, but seeing as she was the only one willing to speak to him without pummeling him, he decided to accept her remedy. After all, when a person only has one friend, the quality of that friend matters less than the fear of losing them. Rudy and Travis had become fast friends when Travis first arrived at the orphanage, mainly because Rudy felt sorry for him. Walkenstock seemed to hate Travis with a particular vengeance, as though he were an imposition. But despite the orphan keeper's penchant for ranting, he was oddly mum about Travis's origins, as if the mere thought of the tale shook Walkenstock to his core. So instead, he filtered his emotions through a funnel of contempt, and that slow drip of cruelty inspired the other orphans similarly. Ruti knew about exclusion and derision firsthand. She was the only girl in the orphanage and had worked to avoid being excluded from activities. She had decided to outdo the boys at everything they did by being rougher and filthier than they were. She would have had dark brown hair naturally, but it had purpled due to moss from all the time she'd spent sleeping in bushes. She often found spiders in her hair, much to her delight and Walkenstock's revulsion. He used to hit her with the only spoon in the orphanage to drive the spiders out, but one time they ended up crawling across the spoon towards his fingers, and he shrieked and relented. After that, Walkenstock just sort of avoided Rudy, as if she were unfixable. Beyond being outcasts, Rudy and Travis shared a fascination with insects and arachnids and all the other little crawly things of the forest. In fact, Rudy had amassed a small horde of rickticks, click-back beetles that could be taught to race. As a result of this, she'd recently gained popularity for her inventing an event she called Rick-Tick Rumble. At his most lonesome, Travis worried that he might lose his only friend now that Rudy had developed an attractive quality. Travis hoped that he could improve his own popularity by competing and winning in Rick-Tick Rumble, but based on his sour luck, Travis was having a great deal of difficulty remaining confident. On Travis's 13th birthday, Walkenstock clumsily created a meal to feed all 25 of the orphans. Based on the hasty nature with which Walkenstock prepared it, and the lack of discernibly edible ingredients, Travis assumed that there would be no birthday treat. In fact, Travis believed that the main ingredient in all of Walkenstock's cooking was either dirt or sand. "Sit down immediately," Walkenstock shouted to the orphans. Not even the birthday boy was free from Walkenstock's militaristic regimen. While Travis considered the reason for Walkenstock's ill will, Walkenstock bopped him on the noggin with the orphanage's only spoon. Travis grimaced and seated himself on the ground where he belonged. All of the orphans were soon seated or crouched around the dilapidated table, more a cluster of planks and nails than a sturdy piece of furniture. Walkenstock had invented a recipe for an extremely low-cost dish he called gwish, which looked like gray vomit. The children hated its silty taste, but if they tried to sneak away from the table, Walkenstock would punish them by locking them in the basement with no light, until he remembered that they were down there. It was so terrible and terrifying in the basement that the orphans no longer risked it, instead gobbling up their gwish, whatever it was, while forcing a smile for the chef. Most of the boys ate it cold off the table. When Walkenstock began plopping glops of gwish before the orphans, his decrepit assistant Needle meandered over to the table holding the orphanage's sole plate. From the eerie, senile look in Needle's eyes, Travis could tell that the old man had an idea, and that whether he intended it or not, this idea would likely result in trouble. With a shaky but somewhat grand flourish, Needle placed the treasured plate before Travis and bowed creakily. "'Tis the boy's birthday," said Needle matter-of-factly. Needle began humming happily to himself, squinting so severely his eyeballs were barely visible. The other orphans stopped forcing gwish down their gullets and gaped at this anomaly. Walkenstock's eyes bulged. "You mindless git," cried Walkenstock, snatching the plate away. "A birthday is no excuse for kindness, especially not to that creature." Travis hadn't even had a chance to touch the plate before Wolkenstock had taken it back. Wolkenstock polished the plate with a vengeance, using the misbegotten rag hanging from the rope around his gut. "Who knows what vile victory is piping within the malcontent?" Wolkenstock mused as he stroked the plate lovingly, trying to rid it of whatever foul curse Travis might have placed upon it. "I cannot take such risks." And with that, Wolkenstock snapped the plate in half, ensuring that no one would ever get the honor of using it again. The other children gasped. Needle sputtered some spittle through his thin yellow teeth onto the white spiky strands of his beard. "You forced me to do it, Needle," said Wolkenstock. "You know I have no patience for chicanery, especially regarding that one." Wolkenstock's eyes turned to Travis briefly, then darted away. That was when Travis had a startling realization. He fears me, Travis thought, shocked by how the fear was reflected in the fumbling of Wolkenstock's hands, his inability to make eye contact, and his repeated refusal to speak Travis's name. In spite of the snapped plate, Travis could not help but smirk. How could this pompous old orphan keeper be afraid of him? Even if Travis had called himself a man, he was still a much smaller man than Wolkenstock. To an orphan, Wolkenstock was a towering pot-bellied ogre. He could smash me to bits like that broken bed upstairs, Travis thought. But there it was, clear as day, fear in old Wolkenstock's eyes. Suddenly, a memory flashed in Travis's mind. He had seen that look before, in his father's eyes, on the day his parents had died. Travis had only been 4 years old, so the memories were spotty at best, but he remembered the heat of the flames that had consumed his family. And he remembered his father's eyes. What happened that night, Travis wondered. Was it just a normal fire or some feat of victory? Is that why Wolkenstock is so afraid? In the common parlance of Crankfurt, a Vek was someone who manipulated the particles around them to perform supernatural spells, or Vectory, as it was known. Vector was said to be the force of magic that operated in various forms in all manner of existence. Vex, or Vector users, wizards, witches, and mages, as they were known to the rest of the world, were those who could manipulate the shape and function of the natural world through the power of an elemental aura within them. In doing so, they could seemingly manifest the impossible. As a result, Vex were hated and feared in the kingdom of Crankfurt by the common people. Vectory had been outlawed for years. This made little sense to those science-minded adventurers who dreamt of unlocking the secrets of the world's core, which they believed to be a sphere of pure Vectory more powerful than any other. Travis liked to imagine such things to keep his spirits up, especially in times like these, when Wolkenstock's rage made him particularly unbearable. With a single, sweeping motion, Wolkenstock knocked the gwish off the table and onto the floor, where the more obedient orphans began gobbling it up all the same, like hungry hogs. "That's enough gorging for you lot," said Wolkenstock. "You can thank that one for the meal's abbreviation. Outside with you, but not too far, or I shall have your heads on a pike by sundown." He's just like the president. Nailed it. The orphans raced outside, excited by this moment of unsupervised recess. Rudy grabbed Travis by the shoulder, pulling him alongside her, out through the sitting room and into the cloudy, breezy daylight. From beneath her tunic, Rudy revealed that she'd smuggled Travis's book outside so the two of them could enjoy it together. "Sorry to pilfer this from you," said Rudy, "but I figured you might want a bit of a birthday pick-me-up. Let's try to find the weirdest thing in here, eh?" Rudy was the only person in the orphanage with whom Travis shared his book of creatures. Together, the duo had spent many an hour poring over the book's vivid imagery and its descriptions of magical beings. Just the other day, they had gotten into a disagreement about the existence of creatures called Vile Darts. "One time, a kid got adopted by Vile Darts," Rudy said. "They walked up in human costumes. Wolkenstock was so greedy he sold them 2 kids, no questions asked. Later that night, the Vile Darts drank their blood like this." Rudy made a hideous slurping sound and proceeded to flap her arms like wings. According to Wonky's Crankfurt and Monsters, Vile Darts were terrifying bat-like creatures that lived in the swamp and lurked on 2 legs. They apparently liked to dine on human flesh. They were one of many reasons why Travis and the other children or too frightened to venture into the dark forest of no mercy. And that's chapter 1. And there's a lot more that happens. That's just really the setup. You should click on the link below and pick up the story. If you have Kindle Unlimited, it's free. If you want it on ebook, it's $5. And if you want a paperback, a nice glossy covered paperback like I have here, it's $10. It's also available in some stores if you'd like your local book person or bookstore or whoever, your book delivery robot. It is the future after all. Just tell them, I'd like to order this, and they can order it for you too. Thank you very much for watching, and have a pleasant day. Bye.